I would like to dedicate this award to my wife and research partner, Dr. Kevin Wheldall, who has inspired and collaborated with me for the past 30 years, and without whom much of this work reported here would not have been possible. In our work together, Robin and I have taken inspiration from the husband and wife team of architects, Walter Burley Griffin and Marion Marnie, who designed much of what was to become Canberra and also some of Sydney's Castle Crag. Marion Marnie wrote, "Two people working together can change the world. Dreams come in a flash, but one must fight the whole past to the death to make them come true. Blood, sweat, and tears." In this presentation, I would like to take the opportunity of sharing informally with you my life and career journey thus far. I shall reflect briefly on career highlights, presenting neither research details nor references, both of which will be incorporated in the eventual published version of this address. I'd like to touch upon some of the research work I've been involved in over the past 50 years or so. I've been researching educational psychology and special education now for over 50 years. I was born in Derby in the UK in 1949 into a working class family. Childhood asthma blighted my early years, and consequently I missed a lot of time in school. I also moved home and school a few times so that my progress in learning to read was somewhat disrupted. I became a low progress reader at 6. It was my determined, not to say formidable, mother who in fact taught me to read, so that I was subsequently successful in the 11+ scholarship exam for a place in a selective school named after Sir Henry Cavendish. My school career was singularly uneventful, apart from my frequent turns on the stage in plays and reviews, where I was invariably cast as an upper-class twit. My one claim to fame was to become the school high jump champion, but other than this, I never received a prize or award throughout my entire school career. I devoted my time instead to being the frontman for a band called the Hedgehogs with a Derby accent. So it is with gratitude and some satisfaction that I receive this award from you today. Like many of the post-World War II generation from the English working class, I was the first and only one in my extended family to go to university. What to study, how to study, and navigating the life at the university level was all unknown territory. But I had a supportive family and an ambitious mother. At the University of Manchester, I studied French, philosophy, sociology, and social anthropology, as well as psychology. Enjoyed being the editor of the University Poetry Society magazine, I named Nomanis, continued to play in a band, as you did in those days, and fitted in the odd lecture and tutorial. When 1970 rolled round, I graduated from the University of Manchester with an honours degree in psychology, having spent the previous 3 years wondering whether I should become a rock star or a poet. Almost immediately after graduation, I began working as an academic research associate for Professor Peter Mittler at his newly established Hester Adrian Research Centre, or HARC, quotes, for the study of learning processes in the mentally handicapped, unquote, as it was then called. Essentially, I worked on receptive language development in kids with intellectual disabilities. It was at HARC in the early 1970s that I first became seriously interested in behavioural psychology. As an aside, anything to do with operant conditioning had been virtually banned from my undergraduate course in psychology at Manchester. I completed my doctoral research at HARC, which was subsequently awarded the Education Section Prize of the British Psychological Society. In 1974, I was appointed to a lectureship in the social psychology of education at the University of Birmingham, where I continued to research in the area of language comprehension, including a novel way of assessing the Piagetian notion of conservation using operant conditioning. But I soon became much more interested in using behavioral psychology to help teachers to manage classroom behavior more effectively, working with my doctoral student and subsequently research partner, the late Dr. Frank Merritt. It was in the mid-1970s that my first book was published, Social Behavior, Key Problems and Social Relevance, to, shall we say, mixed reviews. Behavioral psychology was not the most popular approach to take in social psychology in those days, but undergraduate students seemed to like my book. It went on to sell 30,000 copies in English and was translated into 5 languages. Needless to say, and to my chagrin, no other book that I have published subsequently has sold so well. But it did ignite my love of publishing. In 1980, I jointly founded the journal Educational Psychology, published by Taylor and Francis, with my colleague Richard Riding, in an attempt to encourage more truly experimental research in the psychological study of education. Then, in 1981 and 82 respectively, I was elected Honorary General Secretary of the British Psychological Society and appointed Director of the Centre for Child Study at the University of Birmingham. Prior to moving to a chair in education at Macquarie University in Sydney in 1990, I was elected a Fellow of both the British Psychological Society and of the College of Preceptors, and also chaired the British Psychological Society Education Section and the Association for Behavioural Approaches with Children. I subsequently also became a Fellow of the International Academy for Research in Learning Disabilities and of the College of Educational and Developmental Psychologists of the Australian Psychological Society. From 1990 until the end of 2011, I served as Director of Macquarie University Special Education Centre and Professor of Education at Macquarie. It was during the Macquarie years that much of the foundational work on Multilit was completed. I retired from my university role at the end of 2011, following a diagnosis at the beginning of 2009 of multiple myeloma, a cancer of the bone marrow and immune system. At that time, I was given 3 to 4 years to live, so decisions had to be made as to how I would spend the time remaining to me. Other important activities during the Macquarie years centred on Learning Difficulties Australia. One of the enduring and most stimulating friendships that has been very important to me has been with Dr. Molly de Lemos. We worked together on many matters that related to LDA and the campaign for effective reading instruction. I served as President of Learning Difficulties Australia for nearly 2 years from 2005. I also spent many years as the Executive Editor of LDA Publications and Editor of the Australian Journal of Learning Difficulties and also of the LDA Bulletin. In 2005, I was presented with a Macquarie University Community Outreach Award for my work on Multilit with socially disadvantaged groups, along with my wife, Dr. Kevin Wheldall. And in 2008, I was awarded LDA's Mona Tobias Award in recognition of an outstanding contribution to the field of learning difficulties in Australia, unquote. In 2009, I was inducted into the Macquarie University Innovators Hall of Fame for this work, and on Australia Day 2011, I was appointed a member, AM, in the Order of Australia for, quotes, service to education as an academic and researcher, particularly in the areas of learning and behaviour difficulties and through the design and implementation of innovative literacy programs, unquote. In 2014, I was presented with the inaugural award of the Australian Association for Special Education, New South Wales, in recognition of an outstanding contribution to special education. In 2015, I was presented with the 50th Anniversary Special Award by LDA for services to the association, especially its publications and to the field of learning difficulties generally. I have also acted as an advisor to both state and federal government education bodies and ministers on matters relating to special education generally and on behaviour and reading in particular. In the time remaining, I would like to take a decade-by-decade approach to my research over the past 50 years. While my research journey has not been linear, each phase of my research career has provided important perspectives for the one that followed. I have researched and written books, chapters and journal articles in the generic area of learning and behaviour difficulties, with particular emphasis on receptive language development, classroom behaviour management and effective reading instruction. I have researched other topics that do not fall within these three areas, such as the development of very low birth weight babies and vocal pitch in motherese. But in this presentation, I shall concentrate on these three: language comprehension, classroom behaviour management, and reading instruction. Since it's a source of continual amazement to me that we still neglect these in education faculties. In addressing these areas, I will take a chronological approach with dominant research themes. As already mentioned, my earlier research focused on receptive language development, particularly sentence comprehension, which was a hot topic in the 1970s. When I was hired as Peter Mittler's academic research associate, I was encouraged to work on sentence comprehension and to further the development of a pilot version of a test that Peter had been previously working on, called the sentence comprehension test. I was responsible for a complete overhaul of the test, which was subsequently published by the National Foundation for Educational Research. For my doctoral research, I also looked at various non-verbal variables that might influence sentence comprehension in young children, both with and without disabilities. We looked at whether the use of the presentation conditions and the use of intonational emphasis help children to understand sentences presented to them. For example, when asked to select a picture from 4 which best illustrated the sentence, "The boy is not crying," emphasizing the "not" led to greater rates of demonstrated sentence comprehension. Fascinating stuff. When I subsequently moved to Birmingham University to become a lecturer in the social psychology of education, I continued my work on sentence comprehension and looked at the influence of social class and preschool education. I'm not quite sure whether it would be true to say that it was the sentence comprehension work that led to my interest in reading, but certainly as our reading work developed, I realized that the sentence comprehension test had a role to play in determining those kids starting school who had problems with language, and that with a version of the sentence comprehension test, which we turned into a simple screener, we could isolate the ones who were struggling with language. And if you're struggling with language, you're certainly going to struggle learning to read. Incidentally, it was this concern with children's ability to understand spoken language that led to my other research at this time, attempting to develop a non-verbal means of assessing the Piagetian notion of liquid conservation. In one of those all too rare moments of lucid insight, it occurred to me that my developing interest in operant conditioning might provide the answer to the problems of asking young children complicated questions. By systematically training young children to press a button when they perceive 2 glasses of water as holding the same quantity of liquid, we were then able to observe their responses when we subsequently poured one of the glasses of water into a different shaped container. In brief, we found that many more young children could indeed conserve liquid quantity when asked to make their judgments non-verbally. That is, when they were not confused by complicated questions. At Birmingham, I also focused on classroom behaviour management, and this soon became the focus for the following decade. My fascination with operant conditioning also manifested itself in the program of observational and experimental research on classroom behaviour management completed in the late 1970s and 1980s with my colleague, the late Dr. Frank Merritt. In brief, we observed that while teachers, both primary and secondary, continually complained about the amount of time they wasted reprimanding children, they typically hardly ever praised children for behaving well. In various experimental studies, we demonstrated that by catching them being good and praising them contingently, teachers could greatly increase the amount of time students spent on task behaving well. We also found that reprimands were more effective if used very sparingly, quietly, and privately. Our work has also clearly identified, and this has been replicated many times, that classroom behaviour of most concerned teachers is not violence and aggression, as the media would have us believe, but rather the relatively trivial but persistent and time-wasting behaviours such as talking out of turn, or toot, and hindering other children, or hock. Toot and hock account for the vast majority of teacher complaints about student behaviour and lead to low levels of student on-task behaviour. Being on task, paying attention to the teacher and getting on with your work is a necessary but not, of course, sufficient condition for learning to take place in the classroom. Our observational studies repeatedly showed that while teachers typically praise students for good academic product, they almost never praise them for behaving well in class. But by using methods based on what I termed positive teaching, rather than continual loud reprimanding, teachers can be readily trained in how to use positive reinforcement to increase levels of on-task behaviour in their classrooms. We have repeatedly demonstrated this to be the case. Another line of inquiry focused on our emphasis on considering the antecedents for behaviour, which we showed could be just as effective and powerful in classroom management as a focus on consequences. We repeatedly demonstrated, for example, that children spent far more time getting on with their work when seated in the traditional rows format than when seated in table groups, which had become the norm in most primary classes. We subsequently developed these ideas into the Positive Teaching Package, a course for teachers in how to manage behaviour effectively. We demonstrated that after teachers were trained using the package, they became far more positively responsive to students' appropriate on-task behaviour, used far fewer reprimands, and the on-task behaviour of their students was substantially improved as a result. During this period, I also became interested in the behavioural peer tutoring of reading, using the pause, prompt and praise remedial tutoring method developed by my old friend Ted Glynn and his colleagues in New Zealand. When I moved to Macquarie University in 1990, I brought with me my interest in classroom behaviour management and also a developing interest in the problems of older, low-progress readers. I began to focus more on reading than on classroom behaviour. I saw early on that there was a real opportunity to marry much of the excellent work that had gone on before me at Macquarie University Special Education Centre since its inception in 1975, with the work that I'd been doing over on the other side of the world. Helping older low-progress readers became the focus of much of my work in the 1990s, after I had moved to Macquarie. Creating a positive learning environment using positive teaching to manage classroom behaviour was not sufficient. The other necessary condition for learning to take place is effective instruction, but we hardly ever seem to employ it in schools. This has been particularly evident in the teaching of reading. In spite of the failure of whole language in teaching reading, this is the approach that most teachers identified with in the 90s, and which still dominates practice in many of our schools today. I subsequently introduced the pause, prompt and praise method into Sydney schools. We had some success with helping older low-progress readers in this way, often using peer tutors. At the Special Education Centre at that time, we had a special school largely for children with learning difficulties rather than intellectual disabilities. And we began to pilot some techniques, including pause, prompt and praise, and also extensive use of phonics with older low-progress readers. This led in 1995 to my establishing what I called the Making Up Lost Time in Literacy Initiative, or Multilit. Robin has been working alongside me on that all that time. So, we focused our research interest on demonstrating that older low-progress readers could learn to read given appropriate, effective instruction. Positive teaching was also well embraced, and our teachers in the Special Education Centre became expert positive teaching practitioners. We used to boast that our teachers praised at a rate of 100 smiles per hour, and of course we had the observational data to prove it. I recall that on a visit from Professor Linda Siegel from Canada in 2000, she observed our special school teachers in action. She commented that she had never seen anything like it and that it was the best teaching she had ever seen. Effective classroom management and effective instruction in reading was proving to be a winning combination. Another important area of our research in the early 90s was to carry out one of the very first experimental evaluations of reading recovery, whereupon we were able to point out its limitations. At that time, when young children failed to learn to read, we tended to give them more of the same in the form of reading recovery. Our experimental research, which Tim Shanahan called one of the more methodologically sophisticated studies, clearly showed that reading recovery was at best effective for only one child in 3 exposed to it. But it is only now, some 30 years after we showed this, that reading recovery is finally being questioned worldwide and replaced with more effective interventions. We also started working with the Reverend Bill Cruz and the Exodus Foundation, providing tutorial centres for socially disadvantaged, low-progress readers on the cusp of high school. These students from the Inner West and later Redfern, Gladstone and Darwin participated in intensive literacy programs every morning for 2 terms, helping them to make up lost time in literacy. This collaboration with Bill Cruz was to go on for 20 years, helping thousands of students to gain all-important skills in reading and demonstrating repeatedly the effectiveness of our Multilit programs. The Commonwealth Government became interested in what we were doing with Multilit, and we were commissioned to conduct a research evaluation covering the first 3 years of Multilit in many and varied contexts. The research report, An Evaluation of Multilit, was published by the Commonwealth Government in 2000. Notwithstanding the effectiveness of multilit implementations, the prevailing orthodoxy of whole language methods of teaching were well and truly entrenched, and we were still pushing against the tide. This frustration with ineffective instruction in reading and related skills led to the further development of Multilit. By employing a rigorous, intensive, systematic, skills-based program of instruction, we demonstrated repeatedly that low-progress readers can make extraordinary progress. By incorporating what we have learned about how reading works from international research over the past 40 years, and coupling it with what we know to be the most effective methods of instruction, we now have programs that make it possible for most non-readers or older low-progress readers to reach at least functional literacy. Our research attention turned to coming up with a more effective and a more cost-effective intervention for at-risk struggling readers in Year 1, known as Multilit. Our response to the lack of effectiveness of reading recovery, if you like. We are expanding the offerings of Multilit and moving down the years to try and avert the large numbers of instructional casualties that were occurring in the education system. Moreover, by using curriculum-based measures of reading, such as the Wheldall assessment of reading passages, we were able to track the progress students were making over successive weeks and modify their instruction accordingly. This work made our approaches consonant with the response to intervention framework, which was starting to gain traction. The noughties decade was when we became engaged more fully in the efforts to increase the English reading skills of Indigenous students. Noel Pearson contacted me after seeing an article in the Good Weekend magazine and invited us to Cape York. So began a series of projects that demonstrated that Multilit also proved to be very effective with Indigenous students in remote Aboriginal communities, helping them to catch up with their non-Indigenous peers in reading and related skills. This work would lay the foundation for a much larger engagement in remote and regional Indigenous communities, but we had to wait some time for this to transpire. It was also during this decade, in 2006, that Macquarie University decided to spin off the Multilit Research Initiative into a separate company, of which I am the chairman. The Multilit Research Unit was also established within the company. This enabled Multilit to scale up its activities considerably. In my research career, spanning 53 years now, I have had little time for so-called pure research. I have had my more esoteric moments, researching eye-widening and eyebrow-raising in response to surprise in nursery school children, for example. But they have been rare. There has simply been too much to be done on a practical level. I firmly believe in evidence-based practice and see experimental and behaviourally based educational psychology as the main means by which we can address the problems confronting education. I tire very quickly when faced with postmodern speculation and so-called critical theory. This is not to say that I have no interest in theory or that I have not attempted to contribute to the development of psychological models. Kurt Levine used to say that there is nothing so practical as a good theory. I agree with this, but also believe that practice also undoubtedly influences theory. It has been very encouraging, heartening and pleasing to see the changes that have taken place in terms of the embracing of evidence-based practice in relation to the teaching of reading and the importance of explicit instruction in the learning of novel content. Things have changed a great deal, particularly in certain states in Australia. For others, there is still a way to go, but we are on the road. There have been difficulties sometimes over the years because of the lack of popularity of our views in those days. Nowadays, it seems like promoting phonics and the science of reading instruction has become de rigueur, but back then it was extremely unpopular. And I also became unpopular with the New South Wales Department of Education, my home state, not least because of our evaluation of reading recovery that they had commissioned. But before we'd even completed our evaluation, the department had decided to expand its provision of reading recovery. So they were not best pleased when I spoke publicly about the limited efficacy of reading recovery and was told off by the department. In fact, something must have clicked in my brain when we signed the original contract for the evaluation project, because I insisted on a clause that said, while the report was confidential to the department, the researchers were permitted to present their findings to academic conferences and academic journal articles. And I sometimes wonder if, but for that clause, we would ever have been allowed to publicise our findings on reading recovery. I've never been too concerned about other people's opinions in that sense, so that has protected me somewhat. My background is in behavioural psychology and, in particular, applied behaviour analysis, which was by no means the flavour of the month in those early days. I think it had hampered my career in the UK. So it was nice to go to the Special Education Centre at Macquarie and find people who thought along broadly similar lines to me. I learned a great deal from them. It was by no means a one-way traffic with this guy from the UK coming in and solving the problems. Far from it. It was very much a collaborative enterprise. And I would like to give credit, in particular, to my colleagues from Macquarie, Coral Kemp, Mark Carter, Alison Madeline, and Marie Reynolds, all of whom had major influences on my thinking and who worked with me on research. Our Multilit research work is continuing, and through the application of the many talents of my colleagues in Multilit and the Multilit Research Unit, we are able to do our bit in ensuring that all children are given the opportunity to learn to read in Australia. The development of Initialit, our foundation to Year 2 whole class instruction in reading and related skills, was developed to complete our approach to a response to intervention framework. We committed to delivering a Tier 1 program that, if implemented with fidelity, would reduce the numbers of children requiring support at the Tier 2 and Tier 3 levels. And in a sign that life often moves in cycles, I am back to doing more research on the language side, where I started out. Multilit's part in the Commonwealth Government implementation programme of Closing the Gap has us currently supporting 42 mainly Indigenous schools across remote and regional areas of Australia to implement evidence-based instruction in reading and related skills. It's both a challenge and a privilege to be involved in this critical work. There is still much to be done, but we have shown that when people come together to work towards a common goal, the result can change the lives of children and young people. So what have I learned from my 50 years or so of research? Follow the evidence, find your tribe, be prepared to be unpopular, learn from one another, be patient, and keep on keeping on. Persistence is key to making a difference. I am delighted to receive the Eminent Researcher Award of the Australian Journal of Learning Difficulties today. The journal has been close to my heart for many years, and so this award is especially sweet. I would like to thank the current editor, Dr. Alison Madeline, for nominating me for this honour, LDA for supporting this excellent journal, and the journal's publishers, Taylor & Francis, for instituting this award.